So we're delighted to have a panel, a three-quarters full panel right now. We're just waiting on Caroline Lucas of the Green Party, but she will be here to answer your questions. But we have, for now, did someone say she's here? Oh, Caroline Lucas is here. That's fantastic. So we are quorate. Apart from Caroline, we have Mark Pawsey of the Conservative Party. We have Emma Reynolds, the housing lead for the Labour Party, and we have a minister, no less, in Stephen Williams over there. So we are going to kick off, I think, by giving you a chance to have a kind of 4-minute intro. So I might just go in randomised order and start with Mark.
All right.
4-minute intro on, yes, what you wanted to say to the renters.
Okay. Thank you, Faisal, and thank you to Generation Rent for the invitation to be here. I'm a Conservative Member of Parliament and I sit on the Communities and Local Government Select Committee, and last year we undertook an investigation into the operation of the private rented sector. And I note that we've got here some renters. I'm told that you're angry, organised and ready to evict MPs. So maybe make my exits pretty soon. I know there are campaigning groups here, I know there are providers of advice, and I know that you have heard from the people who provide houses in the private rented sector. I know that you heard this morning from, I'm sure, what must have been a very courageous representative of the Residential Landlords Association, and they do have a role to play. They themselves have a manifesto, and they launched their manifesto in Parliament a couple of weeks ago with a Labour MP, a Lib Dem, and myself. Not everybody agreed with everything they have to say, but if you look at their manifesto, and I certainly would encourage you to do so, there are lots of things in there that tie in with the kind of things that I think everybody else in the room will be looking for. A second observation is that we're here today in London, just over the road from the House of Commons, and I'm pleased to hear that there are many people that have come from outside London. One of the things as an MP representing a seat outside of London, I'm bothered that very often when we get involved in housing discussions in London, they tend to focus on issues affecting London, which of course, as the capital, are often different from those found in other parts of the country. My third observation, of course, is that on the issue of supply and the very special nature of housing, because of course if a supermarket's got a product, let's say it's a food item, it doesn't taste very nice, it's overpriced, it simply gets left on the shelf, nobody buys it, and the supermarket withdraws it, the manufacturer stops making it. And the second most expensive product that most people buy in their lifetime is a car, and if the car is produced by a manufacturer which is unreliable, or another manufacturer has got a cheaper alternative, then the car manufacturer stops making it or goes out of business, which is what of course happened to the British car industry in the 1970s. But if a landlord or a property owner has got a substandard property, where it may have just some damp patches, or it might not have a cooker, just simply a microwave, or there may be trailing electrical cables, often of course the situation is worse. In most parts of the country, there will be somebody willing to rent it, and it's that mismatch over demand and supply, which I believe causes many of the problems that we face in the sector. And I don't think there's a great deal of disagreement about what we all want, and I'm sure you'll hear from other speakers, but what I'd like to see is a bigger and better private rented sector. And in terms of supply, I'm sure we can and we will argue over figures, over whose fault it is that over the past 20 or 30 years we haven't built enough homes. But there is a very serious question about how we address that problem moving forward. So that would provide us with a bigger sector. A better sector would be a sector where the market for the supply of rented accommodation works better, so that when somebody is looking to move, they find it easier to find the accommodation they want, where they want it, and when they want it. And that involves better information for tenants, so that they know their rights, and also that tenants know their obligations, and in terms of better quality accommodation. And I put my name last week, I think, to a 10-minute rule bill in the House of Commons calling for the decent home standard to be applied for rented property. And we also want to see better landlords. We want to make certain that landlords take their obligations seriously and ensure that there is no place for criminal landlords within the system. So I'm sure there's little disagreement about how we get there, about what we want. The disagreement may be how we get there. And so I'll just address very briefly a number of those points. The issue on increasing supply. We need supply across all 10 years, of course, not just in the private rented sector. And I would argue, and he would say that, wouldn't he, that the changes that the government has made in the planning system through the National Planning Policy Framework has brought forward additional house building with 200,000 planning permissions granted over the last 12 months. That's planning permissions, that's not new builds, but you can't build the houses if you don't grant the consents for the properties in the first instance. And the second thing I think is an importance of understanding the role of the private rented sector in the provision of housing. We know that the sector has doubled in broadly 20 years, but it was almost regulated out of existence in the 40s, 50s and 60s. And I don't think there's anybody here really suggesting that it isn't fair that investors should get a reasonable return when they make their housing available. We want support for new entrants to get started, whether that's on the to purchase or whether to rent. And you will have noticed, of course, the announcement of government yesterday, the deposit loan scheme, which will provide season ticket type loans from employers to cover the costs of paying a deposit. We'd also like to see tenants with more security, and that was a key part of the Select Committee report. Everybody wants to see longer tenancies. There is nothing within the existing legislation to prevent a landlord and a tenant getting together and agreeing a longer period. And of course, many landlords are in the market for the long term. But in practice, the only way for a landlord to get occupation is to have a renewable 6-monthly term. And that's why the Select Committee report said it is important to remove the barriers, and this is a quote from the Select Committee report, it's important to remove the barriers to speed up the eviction process where the tenant breaks the tenant agreement. Of course, the most common breach by a tenant is the failure to pay the rent. And if landlords are able to gain occupation when that situation occurs, they will of course be much happier to offer longer term tenancies. And a further thought is for local authorities, for councils, to make greater use of the existing powers they have in terms of the quality of accommodation. It's the role of the local authority to enforce the law with regard to the quality of accommodation. They've got the powers, the legislation is there are 100 acts and 400 regulations, and often the problem is that local authorities don't use the powers. It's important for landlords to recognise that being a landlord is a responsibility and an obligation that they should take on and not look at lightly. I'm being given the eye by Faisal, so I'll conclude my remarks there and very much look forward to getting involved in questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I know you started talking when you were sure the Green candidate had arrived. I wonder if that's now national policy. Right, Emma.
Good afternoon. I'm going to stand at the front, if you don't mind. Great to be here. Great to see so many of you here this afternoon. I want to congratulate Generation Rent, the NUS Shelter and the other organisations involved in this event. But I want to pay tribute in particular to the work of Generation Rent, who I feel really pushed the issue of the raw deal that many private renters are getting right up the political agenda. And many of you will say, not before time. And as Faisal has said, many young people, but not solely young people, are worried about the conditions and the deal that people get in the private rented sector. I think that we need a government that is absolutely determined to change the way that the system works. We now have 9 million people renting in the private rented sector. Over 1 million of those are families with children. And actually, although there are lots of young people renting privately, there are also lots of now slightly older people, I put myself in that category, over the age of 35. Nearly half of all renters are actually over the age of 35. So many people actually settling in the private rented sector, either because they're priced out of home ownership or they can't secure a council or housing association home. And if you're renting from a private landlord, not only are you likely to be spending more of your household income on that rent rather than compared to those who've got mortgage payments or obviously own their house outright, or if you're living in a social home. So you're likely to be spending more of your income on that rent. You're likely to have poor conditions. 1/3 of homes in the private rented sector are not decent. You're likely also, more likely than any other tenure, to experience damp or mould problems as well. So essentially you're paying more of your income, but you're getting a poorer standard, and you're also facing huge insecurity with most tenancies only lasting a year. And that's why the Labour Party is absolutely determined to change the way that the system works. Not by a voluntary approach, because we simply don't think that will work. We have one of the most short-term, insecure private rented sectors in Europe. I've lived in France, I've lived in Belgium, I've seen what happens in Ireland, Germany, Spain and other European countries where they have much more security for tenants and where tenants have much better rights. So the Labour Party is going to do 5 things. The first is we are going to promote and secure 3-year tenancies as the norm. So if you are a young person and you want a shorter term tenancy, you can have that flexibility. But for everybody who wants that 3 years, they will be able to get a 3-year tenancy. Secondly, we're going to put a limit, possibly, for example, inflation, a measure of inflation, on the rent increases during the time of that tenancy. Thirdly, we're going to ban letting agent fees, which can be upwards of £300, £400, £500, £600, £700 just for paying for perhaps an inventory or a tenancy that actually landlords are paying too. Sometimes there's double charging of fees, and we simply don't think that's right. The principal relationship and contract is between the landlord and the letting agent, and the landlord chooses the letting agent in a way that the tenant doesn't choose the letting agent at all. The tenant chooses, a prospective tenant chooses a property, so we're going to ban those fees on tenants. Fourthly, we're going to introduce a national register of landlords, because many local authorities who want to do the right thing and want to drive up standards in the private rented sector, they say to us that one of the biggest problems is knowing where the landlords are in the first place. And I want to give greater flexibility and power to local authorities to make sure that they're enforcing standards in the private rented sector. Finally, we want to make sure that properties in the private rented sector, and I didn't say this in my introduction, but this is also the case, if you're renting from a private landlord, you're also more likely than not to be living in a property that doesn't meet very ambitious energy efficiency ratings. So we are going to set a target of level C. That's a very good target for the private rented sector. We're going to work with landlords to make sure we can make that happen, but we think we need to force up standards in that regard as well. But one of the reasons that we're all sitting here today, and one of the reasons that we have this problem, is that the demand for housing is outstripping supply. And I'm not going to lie to you and say that this started in May 2010 when there was a change in government. This has been going on for quite some time and for quite some decades. So certainly there has been a systemic problem with the market not delivering anywhere near the number of homes that we need. We're not even building half the number of homes we need at the moment to keep up with demand. I don't think this government is doing enough. Yes, okay, the market is recovering, but it's not enough to just simply let the market recover. We've seen the lowest level of house building under this government in peacetime since the 1920s. We have an ambitious and comprehensive plan to get house building going again by giving local authorities greater flexibility, greater power, by making sure that we are investing in affordable homes. So it's not just the numbers, it's not just about getting to the 200,000 homes a year by 2020 that we've talked about, it's also making sure that local people can afford those homes, and that is absolutely crucial. And in terms of the private rented sector, we simply don't think that a voluntary approach is working. We have a very short-term culture in the private rented sector, one that is not replicated in other European countries. It doesn't have to be like this. Tenants can get a fairer deal, and frankly, many landlords want more stability as well, but we think we need to legislate for this with 3-year tenancies, with a limit on rent increases during the time of that tenancy, and by making sure that tenants are not getting ripped off by letting agents as well. So I am absolutely delighted to be here to talk to you about this issue. I'm just as passionate about making sure that private renters get a good deal, a fair deal in the private rented sector, as I am about making sure that we deliver and build the number of homes that we need so that the younger generation are not priced out of home ownership. Thank you.
My control over timing is worse than controls over rents, it seems. So let's say 5 minutes. I think we've gone up to 5 minutes. We've inflated to 5 minutes rather than 4 minutes. Minister Stephen.
Thanks. Well, Emma set a precedent now for standing here, so I'll do it, which means the rest of you have to look at the back of me, unfortunately. I can just about see the clock. Can I first of all apologise? I know you're intending, I think, to go on beyond 4 o'clock, but as was known when I agreed to come, I will have to leave at about 10 to 4. And that's simply because I'm launching a charity appeal with Prince Michael of Kent for the Bristol Eye Hospital over the road in the House of Commons, so it's like I can't be late than that. I'd like to start where Emma left off, really, and about numbers, because that's basically the problem, that over the lifetime of certainly all of us on the panel, I think, we simply haven't built enough houses and flats in this country to meet the growing demands of our growing population. And as society changes, more people are living longer, more people are living on their own as well. And the house building industry, and indeed successive governments, haven't caught up with that societal change and plan to build the right number of homes that we actually need. Emma said that we've reached a low point in house building. That was true in about 2008 when there was a credit crunch, there was a collapse in the housing market. So we peaked in terms of the number of houses that we were building at about 170,000 in 2007. It went to about half of that for the next couple of years and is now picked up to about 130,000 houses and flats that we think will be built this year. But that, although it's a big increase from where we were, that is simply not enough. And what the Liberal Democrats have said is over the next decade, we need to get to a point where we're building about 300,000 additional units of housing a year to keep up with those societal changes and to then deal with the basic problem that we have in the system of a market that isn't working because the supply simply isn't keeping up with the demand. And that's why we have prices going up, whether it's the price to buy, which most people aspire to want to do, or whether it's the price of rent, which is obviously directly linked to exactly the same thing, because ultimately someone is owning the property and is seeking to recover their investment via rent. So whether it's rent or buying, it's a supply and demand problem that we have. And the only way we're really going to solve it isn't through price controls, which is what Emma and her Labour colleagues are advocating. Price controls never really work. They may work as a very short-term fix, hold prices for a year or two, but ultimately that pent-up demand will still be there and people will leave the market if they feel they can't make money, and fewer houses will be built, which would be a disaster overall. So we think what we need to do, and there should be an important role for the state in this, is to drive up the rate that we're building new homes. And the state, whether it's through local government or whether it's through national government, will have an important role to play in that. The last time Britain built a serious number of houses, sort of heading towards £300,000 a year, was well before I was born, back in the 60s and 50s. And the difference in between then and now was that the state was a big player. Local authorities built lots of council houses and flats. Lots of mistakes were made in that period in terms of quality. They didn't necessarily meet what tenants wanted, so we don't want to go back to that. But there will have to be a return to local authorities building houses for their own communities, and that's why one of the things that I've pressed for in the 18 months that I've been a minister responsible for regulation of housing in the government is a relaxation of borrowing controls on local authorities so that they can build more. So in the current year, those that have reached the limit of their borrowing borrowing have got an extra £150 million to borrow and spend on building new houses, and that is happening, and the same will happen next year. And if there is a different coalition arrangement after the next general election, I think that will need to increase more in order that we get local authorities seriously back into the house building industry, alongside housing associations who have a critical role to play here as well. But we also think there is a serious role for the state directly, because the large volume house builders, and they now increasingly dominate what is built, aren't altruistic. They're not building necessarily for the needs of society. They have their shareholder obligations they're primarily needing to meet. So we're saying that there should be a role for the state through its own land to directly procure the building of housing to get that volume up. We've just agreed with our Blue Coalition partners an experiment on that just north of Cambridge at a place called Northstowe, where the state will be directly commissioning the house building on site, and I think that's a model we're going to have to adopt in the future. But as well as the numbers, obviously people will be looking at the conditions in the private rental sector as well, which is very important in my own constituency of Bristol West, where about 40% of people rent. In terms of letting agencies, what we've been putting in place right at this moment in government, and this has come largely from pressure from my side of the coalition, is meaningful regulation of letting agencies. They're all now forced to belong to an ombudsman scheme, and there are 3 of them, so that people can complain about malpractice in the area. We are insisting on absolute transparency in letting agency fees, so people can see straight away what is being charged to the tenant, and it may be appropriate for a fee at least to be charged to the tenant, and what is being charged to the landlord. So there should be no double counting, double charging that Emma referred to. That will be washed out almost immediately by transparency. But more importantly, you'll also be able to see that for things like the credit reference checks, the inventory fee and everything else, there are really costs that should be borne by the landlord. That will be clear and apparent for everyone to see, and a lot of bad practice will disappear, we think, almost overnight in those circumstances. But if they don't, what we've said is after 12 months of that transparency being in place, if the bad practice has not disappeared, if the NUS, Acorn and everyone else, Generation Rent, think there is still a huge problem in this area, then it will be made mandatory as to what the landlord should be paying and what, if anything, the tenant will be paying. So that's a huge improvement coming along. The other improvement, just 30 seconds, is in terms of the sort of security of tenants on retaliatory eviction for people who complain about poor conditions in their property. I supported for the government Sarah Tether's private members bill a few months ago to outlaw retaliatory evictions. We've worked very closely with Shelter on that campaign. Unfortunately, it was talked out by 2 Tory MPs, so it's been brought back this week as a government amendment in the House of Lords, and it should be law before we get to the general election. So lots of good things are going in place. The private rental sector is important. We need to build more of it, more purpose-built private rental accommodation. That's the big difference in between here and the European countries that Emma mentioned. So it's a quality experience for everyone, as well as an important choice when you decide where to live. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you so much, and many apologies for being a little bit late. One of the challenges of being the only representative of my party here is that I need to be in about 6 places simultaneously, and I haven't quite got my head around that. But I am very delighted to be here this afternoon and want to add my thanks and congratulations to Generation Rent and indeed to all of the different organisations who've put together this incredibly important meeting. And what I have come to say is that for the Green Party, we believe that access to a secure, decent and affordable place to live should be a basic human right. Yet for millions of people, as we know, that simply isn't the case. In my Brighton Pavilion constituency, for example, over 1/3 of households are in the private rented sector. And although there are, of course, some good landlords, there are also some very, very poor ones. And the overall picture that one gets is of unscrupulous letting agents, rocketing rents, eye-watering letting fees, cold, damp homes, and short-term, precarious contracts. And it affects literally every aspect of people's lives. It affects people's health, it affects their kids, it affects how much they can work, it affects their hopes for the future. And I think it really is true to say that unless you've got a place to live that you can genuinely call home and feel that is secure and safe, then it's very difficult to get any other aspect of your life right. And the importance of today's meeting, of course, is because it's a recognition that we do face an overwhelming housing crisis today. But what I would like to say is that I think we should be very clear that this housing crisis hasn't happened by accident. It's actually a direct result of the policies of successive governments. And this particular government's record on housing, I think, is frankly unforgivable. This is a government that refuses to end selling off of council homes, a practice which is decimating our affordable housing stock. It's a government which has refused to fully lift the borrowing cap, so that councils still aren't able to borrow fully against the value of their existing property in order to get the finance to build more council and social homes. Just before Christmas, MPs from the Conservative Party succeeded in talking out an attempt by other MPs to end the appalling scandal of revenge evictions. And just this week, we had developers themselves saying to ministers, urging ministers to scrap a government policy of exempting developers of empty buildings from having to fulfill affordability requirements. I mean, I think that really tells you something when the developers themselves are saying to the government, hang on a minute, that's going a bit too far even for us. So over many years, the bottom line is, as others have said, that not enough affordable homes have been built. And that's why the Green Party has announced this week that it would build 500,000 sustainably built affordable homes before the end of the next Parliament. And it's also why we've launched a housing charter, which would significantly rebalance the relationship between tenant and landlord and give real powers back to the tenant. With the mean housing price in Brighton Pavilion now 10.5 times the mean salary, then owning is simply out of the question for thousands of people. So let me summarise very quickly 6 key things from that housing charter. And first, it is about security of tenure. We would follow the proposal by Shelter and end the instability and insecurity inflicted on those in the private rented sector by introducing a default 5-year tenancy. That doesn't mean to say that if you as the tenant wanted a shorter tenancy, you couldn't get one, but the default would be a 5-year secure tenancy, so you can invest in a property, you can make it a home, and you know that you've got security for a certain amount of time. We also would bring in some smart rent controls. Smart rent controls are where the rent can't rise higher than inflation, guaranteeing a degree of fairness and predictability for both tenants and landlords. But it's not enough simply to say that rents shouldn't go up too much beyond where they are now, because we all recognise where they are now, particularly in the south of England, but in other places too, is frankly simply too high. So we would also launch what we're calling a living rent commission, and that would include housing experts from around the country who would get together to talk about how we could go further than smart rent controls without having the perverse impact of landlords then not bringing property forward to be rented. But how could you begin to ratchet down rent so that they could begin to be in some kind of alignment with affordability? I think that is one of the most critical questions that we face today. And while smart rent controls go halfway towards ending the problem, it doesn't go the full way, and we need to be looking much more ambitiously as well. We too would introduce a national register of landlords linked crucially to a mandatory licensing system to improve housing standards. That would guarantee decent standards across the private rented sector and ensure all landlords have to comply with them. And decent standards absolutely have to include tackling cold homes. And of course, this is Cold Homes Week, and it is a scandal that in the 6th richest country in the world, we have over 20,000 people who will die prematurely in this country this year simply because they can't afford to keep their homes warm. So what we would do would be to look at the fact that we've got the big 6 energy companies cozying up to ministers, still bringing in large profits, and it's no coincidence, unfortunately, that not one penny of the multi-billion-pound infrastructure budget that was announced by the government a few weeks ago, none of that is actually earmarked for energy efficiency. This is the same government, of course, that scrapped CERT and CESP and warm homes, warm front. These were things that were in place to try to make sure that people who couldn't otherwise afford to keep their homes warm had access to taxpayer-funded, government-funded insulation schemes. We don't have that now. We have the Green Deal and the so-called energy company obligation, neither of which are working well. Perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk about that later, but that simply isn't doing the job. So under this mandatory licensing, we would make sure that we would be able to upgrade 1 million homes a year with retrofits that would mean that we could ensure those properties were meeting Energy Performance Certificate Band C by 2025, as proposed by the Energy Bill Revolution campaign. We would end revenge evictions. We should abolish, I think, Section 21 of the Housing Act, because revenge evictions are basically a very clever way of giving landlords power over tenants, so that even when tenants make a perfectly reasonable, legitimate request for repairs to be done or damp to be tackled, they fear to do it because they could be evicted for no cause. We need to end that gross power imbalance between tenants and landlords. We had the opportunity to do that just before Christmas, and as I say, if it hadn't have been for Messrs. Chope and Bone, whoever the other ones were, who were talking it out, we could have had an opportunity to get rid of that. Scrapping letting agent fees, having a licensing system for letting agents too. One of the things I've been most scandalised by in Brighton Pavilion is when I've heard about lettings agents who will discriminate, for example, against anybody who's on benefits, discriminate against anyone who might have kids, and that has got to end as well. Finally, building more homes. Fundamentally, again, in Brighton and Hove, we've got 20,000 people on the housing waiting list, and we need more homes. Not any old homes, but affordable, sustainably built homes. And that can be built through increases in the social housing budget, full removal of the borrowing cap on councils, and devolution of housing benefit to local councils. The final thing I want to say is that I think we should be looking more imaginatively as well. Yes, get rid of right to buy. Yes, bring empty homes back into use. But let's also look at things like expanding community land trusts. Let's look at housing co-ops. Let's look at more imaginative ways of enabling people to live together in the way that they want to and having access to a roof over their heads. There are huge numbers of really imaginative, creative people out there who would love the opportunity to turn an old warehouse into a housing co-op, for example, but they never get the chance to do that. So I'd like to explore ways to unleash that creativity and make sure that we truly do have homes for people to live in.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much. Okay. Right, we're going to split the conversation. We're going to split the conversation into 4 sections: affordability, supply, security of tenure, and then just basically power between tenants and landlords. Let's kick off really quickly, because I'm conscious the Minister's only got about 10 minutes with us as well. So if you have a burning question for him, chuck that in here. So just on rents, and so let's save the issue of supply and building houses for 10 minutes or so, if you can, on whether rents are just too high, I guess. I'll just ask you that question quickly, and then let's bring in the audience. Minister, do you recognise that rents are just too high?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's fairly obvious. Rents are too high, the price of purchasing a property too high, and they both come back to the same issue. We're not building enough places to sort of clear that equation that's out of balance in between the number of people who want homes is growing and the number of people and the numbers that are being built isn't matching it.
Quick answer on that, Emma?
Well, Stephen might not be in denial about this, but there's a Tory minister in his department who claims that rents are going down in London, and he's on record saying that. So I think that is a government in denial. Stephen might not be, but the Conservative element of the DCLG team is. This government, unfortunately, and very regrettably, and I agree with what Caroline said about this, has taken every opportunity to water down affordability requirements, whether it's for developers, where they've changed the notion of affordability, which is no longer now linked to income, but linked to market values. So developers are not building enough affordable homes. We've got the Tory Mayor of London who's calling in big developments to drive down the number of affordable homes, not drive them up. If we had a proper progressive Labour Mayor, they could actually drive up the number of affordable homes in these big developments. We've had only this week where actually the Tory Deputy Leader of Westminster Council has called his own government's policy on vacant properties insane. because they've said on vacant properties, developers don't have to build in affordable homes or contribute to affordable homes either. And even the developers, as Caroline has said, think that this isn't right and think it's going to affect the social mix of our local communities. So I'm afraid to say that this government has done all that it can to undermine affordable house building, and we need to get developers to pay their fair share. We need to make sure that government prioritises building affordable homes, which is what we're going to do, and we need to have a serious conversation about affordability. It's not just about the numbers. We have said that in terms of secure, and this is all linked into security as well, it's quite hard to just disaggregate everything, Faisal, but in terms of the 3-year tenancies that we're going to legislate for, there would be a limit on the increase in rents over the time of that tenancy, so people could have a predictable journey and tenancy and an ability to plan their family finances. We do think rents are a problem. The macro solution is to build many, many more homes, but obviously you've got to do something in the short term as well.
Mark.
Well, we all agree about supply, but I can't speak for London, but outside of London, rents have risen far less than inflation. So, you know, rents outside of London have become more affordable.
Not in Brighton.
Maybe not in Brighton, but certainly
not in Oxford.
I'm talking about
not
across,
in Bristol,
across the country as a whole. The grave concern I've got about a 3-year fixed-term contract, or if the landlord's got to let for 3 years, he'll simply build in the future increase in year 1. So instead of accepting a relatively lower rent now and accepting that it'll increase over the 3-year terms, he'll simply ask for a higher rent at the outset. And I don't see that 3-year arrangement as doing anything to make renting more affordable.
And I do worry that you might be a little bit right about the limits too. I know, it worries me.
Conservative agrees with Green.
No, only for a very short time, not for long. Only that I think that there are weaknesses in smart rent controls. I think they will be better than the status quo, but they don't go far enough, and that's why I think we do need some kind of conversation, which will be different in different parts of the country. I accept the fact that there may well be places in the country where it's less of a problem, but certainly in the south of England, it is a major problem, and therefore having some conversation about how we could begin to ratchet rents lower.
So in my own constituency in Wolverhampton, actually, if you bought in 2007, the price has not yet gone, and there is an argument that prices were overinflated. In London, prices just continue to go up and up. They stabilised a bit during the crash, and then they continue to go up and up. It's mostly a free market. Right. Private rented sector is definitely a free market governed by supply and demand, and the problem is restriction in supply overall in terms of houses. The weird combination in housing is that obviously you've got council houses, rightly so, and housing association houses where the rents have been controlled because to make sure that people on low incomes and people who are vulnerable and people can get housing. So there's a weird combination in housing between a free market at one end and not at the other. So
can I just ask one question, because it really is...
I just want to bring in the chance for anybody here to put a question to the Minister, very specifically, because he's got to go now. So really quickly, gentlemen here.
Very quickly, we heard from 2 of the speakers talk about controlling the cost of heating properties by making them better insulated. Didn't hear anything from you, Minister, so if you could answer that before you go, I'd be grateful.
And from next year, 2016, there'll be another tightening. The legislation is just finishing, going through Parliament at the moment in order to do that, when the norm will be triple glazing. I think it's 200 millimetres of wall insulation and the most energy efficient boiler, and house builders will have to pay into national funds in order to retrofit older housing nearby, because that's where the big problem is. That's where the leakage is in people's energy bills. So, because most of our housing stock is old. Yeah, and that's what, yeah. So house builders, obviously, as they build new houses, part of what they'll have to pay on top of that, if they can't get complete energy efficiency on site, is into an allowable solutions scheme, which is very likely to be spent on retrofitting older houses somewhere else in the country. It could be in the same town, but it could be somewhere else if the housing in the area where they build it is predominantly new. It is going to take time, because obviously 90% 5% of the houses that we live in were built by the Victorians and the Georgians, including my constituency in Carolines as well. I mean, virtually all the housing is probably pre-First World War, let alone pre any other war.
Just a quick point, and then he's got to go.
My question is this. I'm a housing advisor. I advise private sector tenants in central London. Quite a lot of the people that I advise are professionals from outside the UK. Virtually all of them that I see, they are gobsmacked by the fact that there is no security of tenure in the private rented sector, and there is where they come from, and there isn't any rent control. And by rent control, I mean rent that's less than a market rent, not the Labour's policy of setting a market rent and then having control over that. What's so special about the UK that we can't do that?
Okay, so Stephen, if you want to answer this, and then we excuse you.
Well, I think overall rent controls, any forms of price controls won't work. I mean, they might be a very short-term fix, and maybe that's why Emma's announced it, but in the long term, they won't solve the problem, because the problem is that basic supply situation, that not enough new accommodation units are being built. The big difference, and I've now said this a couple of times, in between the private rental sector in this country and in Germany, Switzerland, France, other European countries, where it is much more normal to rent long-term in the private sector, is there is a lot of institutional investment in purpose-built private rental sector accommodation, whereas most of the private rental accommodation in this country, certainly in my seat, is often small landlords owning one or two houses that they've bought and converted and subdivided. So it's an entirely different market, and that's what we want to change.
Well, I think we need to let you go.
And in terms of the numbers, yes, which are nearly all conversion. Okay. We're not actually disagreeing. Well, I'm sorry, that's a bit ridiculous. But we're not actually disagreeing. I think we said exactly the same things. The problems arise is because most of the private rental accommodation in this country is conversions of family homes by one or two individuals. In order to drive up quality in the long run, you need more purpose-built private rental accommodation. And that's the big difference in between this country and other European countries.
Okay, Caroline wants to give you a yes or no question. Go on.
The yes or no question is, you've said that buy-to-let is a problem. Would you therefore agree that we should get rid of the mortgage tax relief that gets given to property owners who are doing buy-to-let? It's a nice, practical solution. What would you do?
Well, that's a Treasury spokesman announcement for the manifesto, so I can't give a yes or no answer to that because it's not my responsibility. But in terms of an incentive, I was about to give it. In terms of allocation of.
Well, let him speak, please.
In terms of an allocation of tax incentives for people to change their behaviour, it's the whole point of tax incentives. Incentivise them to do something they would probably do anyway is always dead weight and is not a good idea. So that's my personal opinion. And in terms of the person, I think it's Alex from Generation Rent, who just tweeted, "I'm leaving early to hobnob with a royal." I think that is really disgraceful when I actually said I was going to launch an appeal for eye research. That's what I'm going to do. I'm sorry I have to leave early for that. It doesn't really help with having a dialogue if someone says that in public and they're representing your organisation. I'm not going to hobnob with a royal. I'm launching an appeal for eye research. There may well be people in the audience who have glaucoma, and that's what it's for. So.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I appreciate it. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Minister, for coming. Good. Well, what can I say? That's fired up. Let's continue where we left off. So hang on. So we had a bit of a to and fro. I want to make sure. No, you wanted to come in.
Well, I just wanted to ask what's wrong with this army of individual people who, as an alternative to investing in the stock market or putting their money in a building society account, have bought a property and have made it available for people to rent. Why? And just ask yourselves, what would be the impact on supply if we suddenly excluded that whole cohort of people from offering properties out for private rent?
One of the first things we need to do is to allow councils to replace the right to buy properties that we've lost. These were not replaced at the time. Councils were not allowed to use money. that money was sitting in banks, not able to be used for anything, not even maintenance.
Right to buy, I think, is frankly immoral. It's certainly even more immoral if you're not going to replace those properties that you're using for right to buy. So absolutely that money should be, if it's still going to happen, I don't think it should, but if it does still happen, then every single home that is lost in that way needs to be replaced, several fold by more council homes. And certainly, councils should have the ability to fully use the borrowing cap. The borrowing cap should be lifted, and they should be able to make their own decisions. This is supposed to be a government that champions localism, and yet it's got most local councils by the throat, either by the cuts or by the prevention of councils from being able to provide more affordable homes.
I actually have a different opinion on right to buy.
Well, absolutely. Right to buy has invigorated housing estates. I know, you go into housing estates and you can easily identify the properties where right to buy has been exercised, because those people have invested in their home, they've put all sorts of improvements in, and that's had a beneficial effect in the area. In the area as well. But in respect of the borrowing, I mean, this country was in a massive economic mess between 2008 and 2010, and very simply that was caused by too much borrowing, and the very grave danger is that
it wasn't. It was caused by a banking crisis. It was not caused by too much borrowing. Bloody hell.
Well, that's a whole...
We're going to disagree on that.
That's a whole...
But let me just tell you that it isn't the case that no local authorities are building new homes. I represent a constituency of Rugby, and my local authority has just built some new homes. So it is possible for local authorities to do precisely that.
Okay, all right, we'll come back to you in a second. Let's go to Emma Reynolds.
You're absolutely right. I think that the key problem is that councils haven't been replacing the homes, and it's not their fault, by the way. There's the way that the funding is structured, so that the receipt comes in. It's obviously a reduced receipt because of the discount, and then some of that receipt, a lot of that receipt is going back to the Treasury. So we need to find a way to make sure that councils can replace those homes that are sold through right to buy. One thing that I am very proud that the last Labour government did do, though, is that we invested in the council housing stock. And when we inherited way back when, in 1997, it was of a very, very, very poor standard. Yes, we should have built more, but we certainly invested in the housing stock as it was, and we inherited a housing stock that had outside toilets and some. I don't think we can have a decent debate if people keep shouting at everybody. It's not going to be, this is a democracy. Let's have our say, but let's do it in a nice and polite manner.
You're not getting away with it.
Right.
Anyway, it's really important that we have more local authority housing, more housing association housing, and that we replace. As somebody who grew up in a council flat, I'm actually quite passionate about this, and I think that you should let me have my say. I'm the Shadow Housing Minister, and I'm actually really passionate about this subject. I grew up for the early part of my childhood in a single-parent family in a council flat, so I would rather you didn't shout me down, and I don't think it's going to be good for the debate if you continue to do that.
Right, let's bring in Lindsay. It's Lindsay, isn't it? Okay, the microphone is winging its way to you, and then after Lindsay's spoken, we're going to come to you. Okay? Promise.
Yeah, well...
No, it's Lindsay first, though. Lindsay.
Sorry, I'm Lindsay Garrett from the New Era Estate in Hoxton. Hi. Because we've lived there for more than 3 years, Labour's proposals would have done nothing to help us. You have nothing to say on affordability. Your supply plans will take 25 years to make a difference. So why does Labour insist on imposing rent controls?
The problem with rent controls is that I just simply don't see that they will work properly, and they could put off supply, which would be a bad thing. I think the New Era estate, the problem, you did say New Era, didn't you? The problem was that you had, as you will know better than I do, a number of philanthropists, if you like, who own the estate. Now, they sold it to the highest bidder that happened to be this American investment fund, who were then threatening to kick you out of your homes. I condemn that. I think that was absolutely wrong. Now, they've sold it thanks to public pressure, and I think you've run a fantastic campaign, and The Guardian has really done a great campaign as well in terms of highlighting the insecurity and the problems and the threat that you face. At one stage, you didn't know whether you were still going to be in at Christmas. And obviously now the investment fund has sold it to another company, and we've got to see what happens there. But that is a private transaction. Those so-called philanthropists who owned your estate and kept the rents low, they did sell it to the highest bidder. They did sell the New Era estate to the highest bidder, and it was then that company, a private company, that was threatening people with eviction, which was absolutely wrong. We want to see greater security of tenure, and we want to see people being able to plan into the future, which is why we've talked about and why we will bring in limits on rent increases over the time of the tenancy.
Faisal, can I talk about security of tenure?
Sure.
I mean, what the problem is that the market has developed into lots of renewable 6-monthly tenancies. And ask yourself why that is. That's if you're a landlord and you want to get occupation of your property. In theory, you can go through the courts process, but it's incredibly long-winded. And I'm sure most of you know that if somebody doesn't pay their rent, most landlords will simply accept the loss and then bring the tenancy to an end at the end of the 6-month term. And that's why we have got these renewable 6-monthly tenancies, which I don't think are any more desirable than anybody else here. There are lots of the people that the gentleman over there denigrates for investing in property. They're in it for the long term. They want a 10-year investment. They would love to have a much longer tenancy, but the ability to get occupation, if the tenant fails to honour their side of the bargain, is the reason they don't. And in the Select Committee report, this was a cross-party Select Committee report with Lib Dem members, Labour members and Conservative members, we argued that it was important to be able, in those circumstances, to allow the landlord to gain occupation more quickly, and in those circumstances, there are no reasons why the landlord and the tenant will not be able to agree a longer lease term between them. Now, there will always be people who are going away abroad for a year or travelling to another part of the country for a year and only want to let their property out for a year, in which case that can be made very explicit in the early negotiations. And one question I've got for Emma, which I don't know the answer to, is that these new 3-year tenancies, what happens if somebody simply goes away to another part of the country for a couple of years on a fixed-term contract? Can they still rent their house out for just 2 years under your plan?
There has to be some protection for landlords, because there will be circumstances. For example, if it's an elderly couple and they happen to own another home, which a lot of landlords, as we discussed, only have one extra, a lot of landlords are small landlords. Say one of them goes into care and they need to sell the extra home that they're renting out, then there will be protections built in to allow landlords to regain possession of their property should they need to. But they will need to prove that there is a need to do that. But many buy-to-let landlords...
What about the example I gave you of somebody taking a job somewhere else in the country for just a fixed term of 2 years? Can they let for 2 years?
If they need to regain possession of their home for a actual specific reason, not just to evict somebody. Because at the moment what we've got is section...
Hold on. So we're getting some detail now. So they're not fixed 3-year terms then?
Well, it's a default. It's a default option.
It's a default 3 year. And Caroline's right, Shelter has done a lot of work on this. You'd obviously build in protection for the landlord. There are cases in which the landlord needs to go back to their home or needs to sell their home. But there are lots of buy-to-let landlords who own property outright and don't have mortgage payments on those properties. And they are using rent increases in an order to evict people, which is why we need a limit on the rent increase over the time of the tenancy.
We're talking about security of tenure, but you do accept that there are lots of small independent landlords who would be more than happy to grant leases, tenancies of a longer term than 6 months, up to 3 years, 5 years and possibly 10 years.
But the problem we've got at the moment is, because it's a rolling over thing, when somebody signs that tenancy and it's for a year, and they say they've got kids at a local school, they have no idea if the landlord is going to say, okay, we keep needing to renew and renew and renew. That's no good for that person. That doesn't give that person any security at all. I'm explaining what the policy is.
Do you agree with the Select Committee then that it should be easier to get occupation?
Okay.
Easier to?
To get occupation if the tenant fails to honour his side of the bargain.
You've got to have protection for landlords, that's the case. But at the moment, all the chips are stacked against the tenant, because the landlord can evict through Section 21 for no reason whatsoever, and that is happening when people complain. I agree with Caroline this, and I agree with the private members bill that came forward that was talked out by the Tories. People are afraid to complain because there is a lot of revenge evictions out there. I see it in my own constituency, advice surgeries. We've got to do something to stop that. A lot of it's a totally unbalanced
it's only a couple of chips you're putting on the other side.
Well,
it's not like a huge chunk of those chips.
You have protection for the landlord in cases that they need to regain possession of the property, but you do not let them evict for no reason whatsoever. And the gentleman over there talked about European comparisons, Germany, France, Ireland. We have a particularly unbalanced arrangement in our country, and it doesn't have to be like that. You can have a more secure system that promotes a longer-term approach rather than this 6-month approach where actually, you know, especially with a family who've got children, they can't plan at all, even for a year.
So just to check, you're pretty much, you think the default period should be 5 years rather than 3, but pretty much you have the same philosophy.
But it's the same principle, and I think we shouldn't, you know, of course there's got to be some flexibility, but there are 2 key reasons why a landlord would be able to come back and get access sooner. One would be if they are going to sell the property, and second would be if they are going to go and inhabit it themselves, like your example of someone who's gone to another part of the country for a couple of years and coming back. But what they wouldn't be able to do is to simply get rid of people in order to bring in someone else at a higher rent. And that is what we're trying to get rid of. That is what is happening. That's what the letting agents actually are doing hugely as well. Sometimes landlords don't actually necessarily know too much about what letting agents
are. The letting agents trying to push the landlord.
Can I just clarify one thing? This would be enforced by councils or the police, or who would enforce this?
Well, you would.
So I say I'm a landlord, and I sort of I said I was coming back to inhabit. I inhabited for a couple of weeks and then rented it out at a higher price. Would you really be able to stop me?
I mean, the tenant could then take action against the landlord, but that is obviously difficult. I mean, it's in good faith. You have to have some exceptions.
So it's not enforceable.
You have to have some protections for both sides. A landlord needs to be able to, in certain circumstances, to either come back and live in a property or to sell the property. Say they've got a crisis where they one of them has to go.
I want to bring Leslie in.
Can I just one thing on enforcement, because you can do it with if you have a register of landlords and if you have licensing of landlords, if you have a landlord who is abusing this, you can simply stop them from doing it.
There we go. Does that satisfy you? Any of what you've heard here satisfy what you understand as being a control on rents, extra power?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Does any of what you've heard up here constitute, you know, support and comfort for the sorts of things that you...
No, actually, definitely not. I don't see how we can have any comfort. I mean, from my own experience and hundreds of other people I've spoken to across London and across the country are being forced out of their homes, facing eviction, having to go into hostels with their children due to the unbelievable hike up of rents. I mean, how can we take any comfort? There's no comfort in that at all.
But I mean, I'm genuinely interested in what else, because we've talked about not allowing revenge evictions. We've talked about the importance of the smart rent controls, which stop it going up too fast. I've also talked about the idea of let's make sure we've got real rent controls, but there needs to be still some discussion about how you do that without the perverse consequence of less property coming onto the market. But if you
talking about package, it's great, and I agree with a lot you're saying, but it's actually, we want it to happen. It's not happening. That's the problem. You know, we're in situations where our rents are going up, are completely unaffordable, and we're being evicted. This is the point. People are losing their homes, and that's the issue. And it's all very well and good talking about it, but we need to see change. We need to see it happen now, because ultimately we are going to lose London, and we are going to be forced out, and this is going to continue to happen. And it's been happening slowly over a number of years, and it keeps being ignored. And yes, everyone keeps telling us they're going to do this and they're going to do that, but it's not happening. We're not seeing it. It's affecting us. It's affecting our lives. It's affecting our families. It did me and my daughter. I know what's happening from a personal experience. And of course, you know, what you're saying, I agree with, but it's just not happening. You know, people are facing eviction, and that's the reality of it. The reality of what is happening to London is affected me. It affected 93 families on the estate, on my estate, and we're not the only ones. I've spoken to hundreds of people in similar situations on large scales. There's 43 families in Brixton that have been served with eviction notices purely because they have been taken over by Peabody, and Peabody have put their rents up to unaffordable rents. Why is it allowed to happen? Why is it continued to be ignored? And we're having to deal with the consequences of losing our homes and being forced out of London. It's absolutely disgusting, and no one's doing nothing about it. No one.
Thanks. Could you pass the microphone just to the gentleman in front of you? Just the gentleman there. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Hi. Yeah, my hearing hasn't improved, or it's not working, whatever you're doing. I can't hear a damn thing anyone's saying. Now, when I was a kid in the 50s, we lived in a council flat. My dad earned about £20 a week, and we paid about £3 rent. Now, if I'm working it out right, that's about 1/7 of his earnings, right? Now, I'm glad they're not living now, because he'd probably be paying about £12.50 rent, or based on those wages. When is anyone up there going to wrest back control from the fucking market and go back to social housing, for Christ's sake? That's what we want. That's what everybody wants. Social housing.
Okay, well,
let's have it.
Let's extract this.
And we don't want to start tinkering. We don't want tinkering with the status quo. We want a bloody revolutionised way of affordable homes for everyone.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So
no right to buy.
To buy. Now, this would be a good moment then to sort of change the direction of the conversation and start talking about house supply. Okay. Now, I didn't know about your house supply policies. It's 500,000, did you say? 500,000 sustainable homes by the end of the next Parliament. Okay. How does that work?
Well, I'm just anxious, first of all, the acoustics in here are terrible. Can you actually hear us?
You're not the only one who's...
Because I struggle to hear some of that, so let's hope that because I feel that I have been talking quite a lot about getting rid of the right to buy, about bringing forward more properties, about the ludicrousness of affordable being defined as 80% of a market rent. That is not what is affordable. You need to have something that is genuinely affordable to people, and your example of 1/7 of your income sounds, more like a decent litmus test of what's genuinely affordable. I think that we ought to have a mass affordable housing drive. Where's the money going to come from? Well, partly we've got a new infrastructure bill that this government brought forward. It seems to me that one of the best bits of infrastructure we could be building far before we get on to HS2 or anything else would be homes for people to live in. So I want to see that money used to build homes. I think it would pay for itself after a while, because it would be a massive job creation scheme as well. So lots of people who aren't employed would then be involved in construction. Their taxes would be going back into the revenue. It becomes self-fulfilling. You can make sure that every home is properly insulated. It is crazy that the housing standards in this country are so far behind what's the case in many other countries in Europe. And the minister spoke before he left about how there are going to be higher environment standards, energy standards in homes. Well, it's a lot less high than many of us would have wanted, and tried to get more ambitious standards around that. But the bottom line is that over successive governments, not enough homes have been built. It is now a national crisis, and we've absolutely got to do it. And affordable has got to mean affordable, not 80% of market rate.
Okay, just Caroline, just to help us with a caricature of what the Green Party stands for. Occasionally it's said that the Green Party isn't keen on building houses on things like the Green Belt, and that number, surely you'd have to start to question the Green Belt.
We've been talking to CPRE about that, because the Council for the Protection of Rural England, and they are talking about the amount of land that developers already have in their land banks. So it's already, land that you could be building on, not on Green Belt, but that's actually already out there with planning permission, but they're just not bringing forward the property because it doesn't pay them to do so. So again, you've got that market failure whereby the house building profession is essentially, or house building industry is essentially just playing the market, waiting for when it's most lucrative for it to act. I think we need to be involving things like bringing empty homes back into use much more quickly, and we would use empty homes orders much more quickly and allow councils to use them much more quickly.
To be clear, Caroline, you think you can reach 500,000 homes by the end of the next Parliament without changing or altering the Green Belt?
I can't put my hand on my heart and say that there wouldn't be some cases where you might use a small amount of greenbelt, but I could say that the vast majority of that, according to CPRE, could be done without infringing on the greenbelt, yes.
Okay, thanks, Carol.
It's entirely a good thing to use parts of the greenbelt. There's more greenbelt than we need, and one of the things we've said, and the government says, that if a local authority wishes to build on the greenbelt, they've got to find another area of equivalent size to put in so that the greenbelt broadly will be maintained. I think it's a bit rich to bash the house building industry. Well, the house building industry has, over the last year or two, been building houses as fast as they can. One of the constraints, of course, is that much of the capacity in the house building industry was denuded between 2008 and 2010, where brickworks were decommissioned and many people in the building industry moved and the skills were lost. House builders don't make any money by not building houses. They have every incentive to build and deliver the houses.
On their balance sheets, they don't know. It adds to their capital or something, you know.
And the other issue that we've got to be careful is the change the planning system that the government has made. One of the biggest obstacles to getting housing development forward was the NIMBYs who wouldn't allow things to happen in their backyard. One of the things the planning system has done by taking planning down to neighbourhood planning levels where communities can have a much bigger say in what happens in their community has actually led to planning permissions of 200,000 compared to 130 this year compared to 130,000 last year, which will translate into new homes.
If I'm not there, I'm going to get it in the neck from Labour in Brighton. So I need to go and vote. I'm really, really sorry to leave you early. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I look forward to continuing.
Stay. This is still really important. These guys are really important. We can still make this work, and we've paired them off, so no vote will go the wrong way because of this debate is happening.
There isn't a vote quite yet.
Informally. There'll be a job for me in the Whip's office.
Can I just pick up one point there? Because one change the government has made is to make it easier to convert redundant buildings. There's a lot of demand for housing, and Caroline was talking about the ability to convert redundant warehouses into housing. We've made it easier to convert office buildings into housing by taking those changes outside of the planning system, just to make it happen. So there is an understanding within government that we need more housing and we need to be able to make it happen more quickly.
Okay, listen, let's
take...
mine.
That's yours.
It is.
It's all going, it's all happening here, isn't it? There's a
so I can see when the vote is.
Yeah. Scarlet Pimpernel here, stealing phones. Who'd have thought? Right, let's get... I knew you guys were cooperating on the debates, but this is ridiculous. Right, question here.
Two questions. One for Emma Reynolds.
Just one question, we've only got a couple of minutes.
Okay, 200,000 homes a year. How many of those are going to be social homes? Because surely we're talking about, you want people to buy, but surely if those 200,000 were social housing, that would take pressure off the private market and release, because I think at the moment £9 billion a year goes to private landlords. So if you're building social homes, you take people, you take that £9 billion that's going to private landlords and you keep that in the public sector. Okay. Also, secondly, on buy to let, I mean, the Tory MP...
It's 200,000 a year by 2020, which is kind of nearly doubling the number of homes that are being built at the moment. It's going to take, some pretty radical action and government intervention to get those new homes built, because frankly, I don't think the system, if it's left to its own devices, the market is not going to deliver that number of homes.
Just quickly on that. Yeah, we agree that the proportions of affordable should be maintained. There have been some exemptions. The government has granted some exemptions on non-viable sites where the proportions of affordable properties meant that the site wouldn't get brought forward. But the broader principle that either 25 or 40% of housing on a new site should be affordable is one we support.
Okay, just two quick points and then we've got to wrap up. At the back, yeah.
Points I wanted to say specifically to Mark Pawsey. I wrote to you yesterday, actually, and I found out because I'm not your constituent, you can't help me. But I've been in my property for over 12 years, and I'm being evicted on Friday by Rugby School, which is one of the most prestigious boarding schools in the country, that has over 180 properties in WC1 in Bloomsbury of residential and retail units, and I haven't been given a reason why I'm being evicted. I've been there for 12 years, my rent has always been paid on time, and this is something I think all of you raised, specifically Caroline Lucas of the Greens mentioned it, but I don't understand how something like this could happen to someone like me. I've never defaulted in paying rent. I've looked after the place above and beyond the expectation of any tenant. And I cannot believe how lucky I am to be sitting directly in front of you, because I wrote to you yesterday asking to see if you could help in any way.
I recall your email. This is a matter for...
Give me just a second. Give me just a second. We've got to wrap up here. You have to go.
Yeah,
anything you want to respond to there before we let Mark answer those two questions aimed at him?
Well, that we need a fairer system. We need a fairer system for people who are renting from a private landlord, but we also need to hugely boost the number of homes that are being built, both for sale, for private renting, and social housing as well.
Okay, thanks, Emma.
Okay.
Okay, Mark. So there was two questions. There was one aimed at you about housing benefit, David Cameron's announcement, and then the specific thing.
Right, well, the specific issue, thank you for your email, I recall receiving it. There's a convention that one MP doesn't really get involved in the affairs of the constituency. So please talk to your own MP. I'm more than happy to pass any correspondence since the landlord happened. Okay. All right, well, I don't know anything of the circumstances, but if you wish me to pass a communication on to the authorities who just happen to be based in my constituency, I'm more than happy to pass.
I already contacted them. I mentioned Alex has been helping me, a number of other people have been helping me. Do you think the circumstance is fair?
I don't know enough about the circumstances. I don't know this. I don't know enough about the circumstances. It would be impossible for me to comment.
Emailed me 2 days ago and said that they're not going to revoke it. Now these guys have charitable status, which means we all know that they have huge tax relief and stuff. So if you really want to go down this road of being decent and honourable and they were quite happy to take my rent for 12 years and they never said anything. But now, because of what's happening in Bloomsbury and central London, the rents are going crazy. And this is another point which I think is very important. A lot of my local neighbours and my tenants, all of whom rent properties of Rugby School, they are living in fear of not reporting maintenance and repair disputes, in fear that if they do, perhaps they're going to be in the firing line and be turfed on the street like I've been threatened with this week.
Well, okay, we should talk about that in a minute.
It is a matter for your local MP.
A very direct question from the back there. Yes, from the gentleman there, about 18 to 21 and housing benefit. That's your policy, isn't it?
It is, but the objective is to make certain that housing benefit does get to those who are most in need. And for most people, that isn't the cohort of people who are aged 18 to 21.
Right, well, there we go. That's a bit like 15 to 1. And there was one. And there was one left. I just want to say, actually, part of the challenge here is raising the issues in the media as well. And these stories and some of the stories that you've just mentioned are extraordinary. I don't think they get enough attention. So come and badge me at the end.
You'll cover it.
And we'll see about making sure that all these stories get the attention they deserve in the national press. Okay, all right. But I think, imagine that the whole panel's still here.
All right.
Thank you for Mark for staying till the bitter end. And thank you for you for joining in. It was a great session. Really appreciate that.
Yeah. And take power. So thank you very much, Lindsay.
Hi everyone. I'm still not quite used to public speaking, but I'm sort of getting a bit more used to it, so you'll have to forgive me if I seem a bit nervous. I'm Lindsay Garrett. I'm one of the residents and the campaign leader from the New Era estate. I really appreciate to be able to share my story, but it always fills me with mixed emotions, really, because it's a situation that myself and the 93 families on the New Era estate should not have had to face. But unfortunately, it's a reality of living in London today. London and across the country. For those that don't know, the New Era estate was set up in the 1930s, and it was set up for people on low incomes at affordable rents. I've lived on the estate all my life, along with my parents, my nan, my auntie, we're all there. And as most people know, the estate was sold and bought by an American investment company, along with one of the richest Tory MPs in the country. The bottom line is that we set up a very successful campaign, and we fought back. I mean, I have some real serious concerns for the future of London. We live in a capital where renters have no rights. We're at the mercy of greedy landlords and a government and a London Assembly who refuse to cap rents. We see more and more of the selling off of prime sites in London to the highest bidder. And as much as the London Assembly and the government insist a percentage of social housing, the reality is shockingly different.
If you're an individual, a normal person, we're at the mercy of landlords and we don't have a chance, that's the bottom line. We can be evicted within months along with our children. I know that. I had first-hand experience of it. Me and my daughter was facing eviction and we would have had the prospect of living in a hostel. It seems nobody in power is prepared to do anything except to stand by and watch my misery and thousands of other people in my situation. London, not even slowly, is being socially cleansed to make way for the prosperous members of society who don't care about London, who don't love London, have no affiliation to a city, to a place that I call home. In fact, generations of my family lived in Oxton. I'm passionate about this city. I love London. London is now being owned by, London is slowly being owned by overseas interest. Prime examples of Mount Pleasant, sold to a property company in Malaysia. This transaction was completed before anybody really even knew it was up for sale. It'll be interesting to see the outcome. Well, will the development include social housing? Will the rents be affordable? Or do we already know the answer to this? We've got Nine Elms, we've got Battersea, which Boris sold, knowing his so-called affordable rents are way out of the reach of the average person. I'm an NHS worker, I earn £400 a week. How on earth is £500 a week affordable? Affordable to who? Certainly not to me. Or anyone else in my position. I think, what can we do to save our city? What can we do to stop greedy investors and those in power intent on taking it away from us? I mean, for me, and it worked, I think what I want people to know is that we do have a voice. We can stand back, we can stand together and we can fight back. If 93 families on a small estate in Oxton can come together and reclaim their homes, then there's nothing to say that the millions of Londoners can't come together and fight back and save our city. It's worth fighting for. And the only way we are going to do it, and coming together. There are demonstrations going on. There was a demonstration on Saturday. We need more people. We need to have a voice because they're not going to do it. They're not going to do anything. This is not going to stop. This is going to continue to happen and we'll lose our city. And we're going to continue to watch the misery of hundreds of families, people with children being evicted from their homes, exactly like this gentleman here. Thank you for those that supported us on the New Era. I'm determined to keep campaigning for the average person, and hopefully together we can do it.